In 1805, the United States, led by President Thomas Jefferson, fought its first foreign war. The enemy was the Arab nation of Tripoli.
306 Americans were now prisoners.
This is a tough business. People would be killed, ships would be burned.
For the United States, it was a battle for the freedom of the high seas and for the lives of its hostages.
This is a small investment with the chance of a big payoff.
For Tripoli, the conflict was about an upstart nation's blatant violation of her ancient customs of trade and commerce.
The only way to deal with these people is by force.
The eyes of the world were on North Africa, observing with anxiety this violent clash of cultures between America and the Barbary states, culminating in the Battle of Tripoli. The 8th of March 1805, the Sahara. This was one of the harshest environments in the world. In this arid, burning desert landscape, an army of 8 US Marines and 400 Arab and European mercenaries set out on a 520-mile trek across western Egypt. For almost 2 months, they endured near starvation and temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 40 degrees Celsius, before they succeeded in reaching their destination. Their objective was to attack and seize Derna, the second largest city in the country of Tripoli. In command was William Eaton, the US naval agent in Tunis and self-appointed general.
This was the plan of an adventurer, of a romantic, of a man who thought he was able to do almost anything, of a man who probably thought he could talk anyone into doing anything, who could get on the back of a camel and lead this brigade across the sands and take Derna.
Eaton's goal was to liberate over 300 American prisoners held hostage in Tripoli. The attack captured the world's attention, but then faded into obscurity and is now remembered only by a line in the US Marine Corps hymn, which goes from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
It's a wonderful, wonderful story. Here is the young American Republic standing up for its rights. The Navy goes, the Marines land, we march across North Africa.
William Eaton's assault on Tripoli was a battle in the American campaign against the well-established tradition of piracy in North African waters. This campaign is known to history as the Barbary Wars. By the late 15th century, the North African Barbary states of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, which is now Libya, sent corsairs, pirates sanctioned by these governments, to attack foreign ships crossing the Mediterranean laden with expensive cargo.
These men, the Barbary corsairs, are not terrorists. They're sailing in the service of their country, and this is a matter of gathering trade and making money.
In order to protect their ships from attack, all the European nations had, for 200 years or more, given the Barbary states protection money and gifts under the generic title of tribute.
We need to understand that many of these states relied on the revenues from these taxes and tributes. It's the city population, the officials, the army relied on these tributes and presents and fees to survive.
In the late 1700s, merchant ships from the newly independent United States ventured into the Mediterranean to trade with Spain, France, and Italy.
But now we were no longer British. It wasn't the Union Jack over the stern, it was the Stars and Stripes. And so they seized American vessels, expecting tribute. And so American merchants were bedeviled by these Barbary corsairs.
The United States was puzzled by this. They were saying, well, they're asking us to pay tribute just for sailing the Mediterranean. It's like we did something wrong. So the Americans were completely baffled. They didn't understand why they would have to pay for sailing the Mediterranean.
In 1796, US diplomats finally concluded a treaty with Algiers, the most aggressive and powerful of the Barbary states.
I think Tunis and Tripoli looked to the example set by Algiers, which had exacted a huge amount of money from the United States and a promise for yearly payments for more money, and said, why not us?
Yusuf Karamanli was the ruler of Tripoli, known as the Bashar or Pasha. He had come to power by deposing his brother Hamid and forcing him into exile.
Yusuf Karamanli was a very, very interesting character. He was intelligent, ambitious, and brutal.
And what Yusuf wants from the Americans is exactly what he wants from the British or the Portuguese or the Spanish or anyone else who's sailing through the Mediterranean.
He wanted treaties, he wanted raising the usual annual fees, more presents, he wants revenues. So money, show me the money.
But brash young America was not prepared to be bullied by what it considered bribery and unfair taxation.
The Americans were fortified by the ideology of a brand new nation and the principles of the American Revolution. So these two cultures collided, one in decline, one just being born.
After years of fruitless negotiation, President Thomas Jefferson finally decided to take action. On the 2nd of June 1801, he dispatched a fleet of 4 warships under Commodore Richard Dale to attack Tripoli.
I think Jefferson had great disdain for the Barbary states. The idea of organized kidnapping, which is what their policy was, Jefferson found intolerable.
A few days before the American fleet arrived in the Mediterranean, Yusuf ordered his soldiers to chop down the American flagpole.
Yusuf declared war on the United States because of what he saw disrespect from the side of the United States, in the fact that he was not treated as Algiers.
For 2 years, the American ships blockaded and bombarded the harbor at Tripoli, with unimpressive results. Then, on the 31st of October 1803, disaster struck the American fleet. The Philadelphia, a 38-gun frigate, ran aground in the harbor when it was lured into its shallow water while chasing an enemy gunboat.
The U.S. frigate Philadelphia is one of the great ships of the American Navy, pride of the fleet. She's high and dry, she is stuck.
Unable to free herself from the rocks, the crew of the Philadelphia was overrun and forced to surrender to the attacking corsairs.
The taking of the Philadelphia changed everything. It created a situation where 306 Americans were now prisoners, an enormous haul for Tripoli.
The U.S. Navy increased the pressure on the Pasha.
Oh, it was a major disaster for the United States. No question about it. It gave Yusuf Pasha a huge chip to bargain, and Yusuf had the upper hand.
A naval lieutenant, Stephen Decatur, launched an audacious attack to prevent the captured warship from being used against the Americans. He led a nighttime raid onto the ship and torched the Philadelphia.
The diplomats, of course, are trying to negotiate peace, trying to get tribute to release the prisoners.
One of those negotiators was William Eaton, a soldier by inclination and training. He served first during the Revolutionary War, and then as a scout and a spy during the Indian Wars of the 1790s.
There he establishes himself as a willful, brave, self-confident, uncooperative, hypercritical, pain in the neck.
In 1799, Eaton was awarded a plum overseas posting. He was sent to the Mediterranean as a diplomat to the court at Tunis.
Eaton's a fantastically interesting man, fluent in Arabic at a time when no Americans knew Arabic. He had read the Quran. He was very familiar from the day he arrived with the situation.
Essentially a man of action, Eaton designed his own plan to restore peace in the Mediterranean. His scheme was to replace Yusuf Karamanli, the ruling Pasha of Tripoli, with Hamid, the brother Yusuf had ousted and sent into exile.
Am I to understand that you have many followers?
If my brother stole my throne, he cannot steal the loyalty of my people.
Hamid was telling him, oh, I've got followers all over the place, and all I have to do is go back and give me $40,000 and we'll just take the place over.
If you have been robbed, we shall return what is rightfully yours.
In June 1804, Eaton persuaded a reluctant Thomas Jefferson to provide him with 1,000 muskets and $20,000 to help Hamid form an army in Egypt, where he was languishing in exile. By the end of the summer, Eaton's plot was in full swing. It was to be the first attempted overthrow of a sovereign nation by the fledgling United States of America. The 25th of November 1804, aboard the USS Argus, William Eaton, the naval agent for the Barbary Regencies, sailed into the harbor of Alexandria in Egypt. His mission, approved by President Thomas Jefferson, was to help Hamid Karamanli, the deposed Pasha of Tripoli, regain the throne from his brother Yusuf. Eaton's plan was ambitious. He and Hamid intended to assemble an army. Together, they'd march 520 miles across the desert and attack Derna, the second largest city in Tripoli. From there, they would move on the capital city, put Hamid back in power, and free the 300 American hostages. This would be the new American nation's first overseas land war.
Eaton probably saw himself as the liberator. He would go crashing through the gates of the fortress into the cells and free the Americans. It was a wonderful, romantic notion.
Once Eaton and Hamid joined forces near Alexandria, they began to build their army. Eaton hired mercenaries, Christians and Arabs, anyone willing to fight for Hamid's cause.
Eaton offered the one thing that works: money. Quite simply, on an individual basis, it wasn't much, but it was money. That was their loyalty.
Eaton's army of 400 fighters was divided into two groups. The Christian element, numbering just 74 men, was made up of European infantrymen and Eaton's core group of Americans, 1 Navy midshipman and 8 United States Marines.
Secure your arms and ammunition. Attention on deck.
By contrast, Hamid's Arab soldiers numbered over 300. There were several sheikhs. One in particular, called Tayyib, exercised his authority over the other Arab mercenaries.
لا زال عند النصارى العديد من الأسلحة والذخائر، فنحن في حاجة إذن جمال كثيرة.
These two religions had been in conflict for hundreds of years, since basically Islam appeared on the world scene. So there was a tremendous amount of rivalry between the two sides.
لقد هيئت كثير من الجمال ومن الرجال، فأنا في حاجة إلى كثير من المال.
حينما نصل على درنا سوف يكون لكم هدايا كثيرة.
Even before the march began, Eaton and Sheikh Tayyib were arguing. Tayyib felt he was not receiving appropriate respect from Eaton or sufficient rations for his men and their families.
Eaton treated these people in a very suspicious way. He treated them as uncivilized, as primitive.
The 8th of March, 1805, 11 a.m., the diverse little army began its journey. Leading the troops was William Eaton. Although he was officially only an agent for the United States Navy, he wore the uniform of a general.
Eaton, calling himself general, was pure Eaton. Could he do it? Why not? Who was around to say he couldn't?
Riding alongside Eaton was Hammett, who Eaton respectfully addressed as Pasha.
The records we have describe Hamad Gorahmanli, Yusuf's brother, in not very flattering way.
Hammett is a very strange figure. He was not a man to inspire confidence. He was not a great soldier. He did not command loyalty from people around him.
The first day, Eaton's army traveled 50 miles without incident. But the next day, he wrote in his journal of the problems that were only just beginning.
Remained in camp. Some difficulties with the owners of the camels and horses hired for their passage. They demanded advance pay. They became mutinous.
كيف تريدني أن أثق بك وأذهب معك إلى درنا لتعطيني المال؟
في درنا.
أنا في حاجة إلى بعض المال الآن.
في درنا.
But when the army was on the move, Eaton was in his element. He took to the desert like Lawrence of Arabia, dressing in Arab robes like a sheikh, and embracing local customs with gusto.
Have your men, the Christian soldiers, double the guard on the food stores and weapons.
In charge of the detachment of 8 United States Marines was a 29-year-old lieutenant called Neville Presley O'Bannon. A strict disciplinarian, O'Bannon commanded his men with steely authority.
Lieutenant O'Bannon seems to have felt that Eaton hung the moon. He was absolutely dedicated to him and felt that Eaton always knew what the right thing to do was at the right time. "200 miles into their journey, Hammett received some disconcerting news.
Pasha Hammett, what does it say?
Word of Eaton's plan had reached Hammett's brother Yusuf, the Pasha of Tripoli.
It's my brother. He has sent an army.
Over 800 soldiers from Tripoli were speeding towards Derna to defend the city.
Let's go.
The threat of Yusuf's army only added to Eaton's mounting problems. He had run out of money, food supplies were low, and water increasingly scarce. Finally, on the 8th of April, all hell broke out.
كيف بك يا الجنرال تطلب من رجالي أكثر من جهدهم وباخرتكم تنتظرنا في بومبا بالمؤونة؟
أتريد أن تموت جوعا حسنا.
With only 6 days' rations of rice left, Eaton cut off the food supply to the starving Arabs.
Discovering, however, an intention in the Arabs to seize our provisions, I beat to arms.
Fix bayonets!
As they stood with muskets raised and ready to fire, Eaton and his men were completely surrounded by the hostile Arab army.
A body of about 200 advanced in full charge upon our people, who stood their ground motionless.
Here they are in the middle of the desert. The expedition's falling apart, and the Arabs are ready to kill the Christians to get at the rice.
A column of muskets were aimed at my breast.
Hold your fire, man!
A universal clamor drowned my voice.
Pasha Hammett, we've come too far to have this happen now. Have your men drop their weapons now. نزلوا السلاح. Drop your weapons.
If just one man had pulled the trigger a little too hard or something, it would have been a slaughter on both sides.
Eaton persuaded the Arab mercenaries to continue their journey to the coastal town of Bomba, where a US naval ship would meet them and give them fresh supplies and money for the attack on Derna. They still had over 100 miles to cover. The last of the provisions were issued. Eaton's journal vividly describes the gravity of their situation.
In the cistern, we found 2 dead men, probably pilgrims murdered by the Arabs. We were obliged, nevertheless, to use the water.
Finally, on the 15th of April, Eaton, Hammett, and their mercenary force, which had grown to number almost 700 men, reached Bomba, but the bay was empty.
They saw no ships, no supplies, nothing there for them. It must have been very shocking and very, very horrifying to Eaton and his crowd, because they were hungry, they were exhausted.
By the following morning, the expedition was in a state of collapse. No supply ship had arrived, and the Arab warriors were packing and preparing to return to Alexandria.
لقد وصلوا من أين؟ من أين؟
A watchman had spied the U.S. naval ship USS Argus. The Argus had brought the promised supplies and payment for the Arabs.
Captain Hall, we must determine...
Eaton spent the next week in Bomba resting his army and working on his plan to take Derna.
By this time, the diplomatic side is beginning to take over, and Tobias Lear, who was actually the senior diplomat in the area, is entering into negotiations ultimately with Yusuf.
This is an example of where neither side has altogether laudatory motives. Hammett's in it for himself, Eaton's in it to free the prisoners, and the Americans pretend to be close allies of Hammett to help him regain his rightful throne. The truth of the matter is, we don't care about his rightful throne, we don't care about Hammett.
Unaware that Tobias Lear was about to embark on negotiations for a peace treaty, Eaton and his army set out on their 60-mile march to Derna. On the afternoon of the 25th of April, they arrived at the walls of the city. In his journal, Eaton describes the strategic situation that lay before them.
The city was divided into 3 departments, 2 of which were in the interest of Hammett and 1 in opposition. This department, though fewest in number, was strongest in position and resource.
Eaton learned that there were 800 soldiers ready to defend the city. To his great relief, Yusuf's army had not yet arrived.
Undoubtedly, the decision was made at that point that they would attack on the right flank first, because that was closest to where the major fortification of Derna was, and obviously if you could take that out, you kind of knocked out the keystone.
The 27th of April, 1805. By early afternoon, Eaton was in position and ready to attack the city. Commodore Barron had authorized 3 U.S. naval ships from the Mediterranean fleet to assist him. The bombardment would come from the 16-gun brig Argus, the 12-gun schooner Nautilus, and the 10-gun sloop Hornet.
The strategy was a 2-pronged attack, one from the shore that Eaton and the Arabian cavalry would provide, and one from the harbor that the Hornet, Nautilus, and Argus would provide.
Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon would lead the Christian soldiers, a small force of barely 70 men, against the defending army of 800 massed near Derna's stone water battery.
Hammett would take the rest of his people over on the left flank, and they would cut off retreat, because that was the side from which loyalists in the town would attempt to get back into the desert and over toward Tripoli.
The cannon on the city's water battery fired the first shots, aiming at the U.S. naval vessels.
The American Navy bombardment of the city of Derna was horrifying and was awesome. It frightened many people and led to the death of many, many people of that city.
And Hornet was about 100 yards from the walls of the town and just pouring broadside after broadside into the town.
As the American ships attacked from the water, Eaton's men began the land assault. The defenders of the fortified city let loose a blistering hail of gunfire at them. In the southwest of the town, Hammett and his cavalry charged towards the governor's palace.
As the naval bombardment took effect, the gunners were leaving the water battery, and a major portion of them apparently came to the walls on the south side of the town. In other words, they were reinforcing the people opposite Eaton.
Steady, lads, steady!
Eaton and his men came under increasingly heavy fire. Outnumbered 10 to 1, his small army was beginning to disintegrate.
Sir, what are your orders?
The 27th of April, 1805, Tripoli, North Africa. William Eaton, his small force of 8 Marines, and his Arab mercenary army were fighting for control of Derna. Cannon fire from the 3 American Navy ships overpowered the Arab guns firing from the water battery. But in the hills east of the city walls, Eaton's small army found itself under increasingly heavy gunfire. Outnumbered 10 to 1, Eaton had to be extremely decisive in his commands.
The firing went on and on. Eaton could see he was losing his men. He could see that if he did nothing, he would lose them. There would be no attack.
In his journal, Eaton describes the chaos.
Our troops were thrown into confusion, and undisciplined as they were, it was impossible to reduce them to order. I perceived a charge, our last and only resort.
Eaton and Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon were at the front, leading their men as the small army charged across open ground towards the fortified walls of the city.
A charge cannot be done without casualties. 1 Marine was killed outright, a second one was mortally wounded, and 2 others were wounded. But, and up to 9 of the Christians we know of were also hit.
A musket ball pierced Eaton's left arm, shattering his wrist. But Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon kept up the charge.
His group of mercenaries and American Marines were able to storm right through the town after this initial repulse and just took everything before them.
The Marines stormed the water battery. With support from the American ships, Eaton and the Marines captured the most heavily fortified section of the city. At the moment of conquest, O'Bannon planted the American flag on the ramparts.
I don't think that raising the American flag over Derna was a very wise decision by Eaton that time, especially if you are bringing a prince from the Cornwallis family and you want to support a legitimate heir to the throne.
Hammett and his several hundred Arab cavalry charged into the southwestern part of the town. Encountering almost no opposition, they seized the governor's palace. By 4 p.m., the battle was over. The Americans had conquered Derna.
Battle of Derna was the first time that the United States had launched a coordinated land-sea attack with naval vessels providing covering fire for land forces moving in from another direction. I don't think this had ever happened in U.S. history.
For 7 weeks, William Eaton had rallied a force of mercenaries who had little or no allegiance to his true cause. He had marched them more than 500 miles across the searing heat of the desert. He had quelled mutinies and overcome starvation to launch an unprecedented attack on a hostile nation. And in just over 2 hours, outnumbered 10 to 1, William Eaton had won his first battle against Tripoli.
It was Americans going back to the old world to show them that we were a force to be reckoned with, and we wouldn't sit idly by while our ships were taken and their crews imprisoned.
We will call this place Fort Enterprise. Our first conquest in our war on Tripoli. My brother will be most alarmed when he learns we have...
Though Eaton had taken control of Derna, the loyal subjects he had expected to flock to Hamet's cause were pathetically few.
Hamet never assumed real control, and everyone knew it, because what Eaton had were guns and money. He controlled the ultimate power in Derna.
I think as time passed, they recognized that this battle didn't settle the war. This didn't get Hamet really necessarily any closer to being back on the throne, and there was really no visible support.
But Eaton was determined to continue his attack on Tripoli. He wrote immediately to Naval Commodore Samuel Barron, asking for more money, weapons, and supplies.
You would weep, sir, were you on the spot to witness the unbounded confidence in the American character here. We only want a few Marines to proceed to Tripoli for the liberation of our captives.
12 days after Eaton took control of Derna, Yusuf's army arrived at the outskirts of the city. For a week, they sat and watched, waiting for the right moment to attack. Then, on the 14th of May, Yusuf's men hurled themselves into action.
A large force on horseback charged right into the heart of the city. Their goal was to capture Hamet, or either capture or kill him, because they knew if they did that, this insurgency would be over.
But a barrage of cannon fire from the American naval vessels and the water battery quickly repulsed Yusuf's cavalry. Eaton and Hamet were again victorious. The 1st of June 1805, Eaton had held power in Derna for 1 month when a letter arrived from Commodore Barron. Eaton anticipated praise for his victories and a promise of money and reinforcements. The letter contained neither.
One of those qualities so essential in the character of a prince contending for his throne is a serious obstacle to the advancement of his cause. His Excellency must be explicitly informed that our supplies of money, arms, and provisions are at an end.
Eaton was crushed. He had tasted victory. But at that moment, his plan to free the Americans in Tripoli was falling apart. May 1805. William Eaton had fought and won the battle for Derna, but was far from winning the war against Tripoli. He had controlled Derna for a month, but still hadn't received the money and supplies necessary to continue his campaign. On the 1st of June, Eaton received a devastating letter from U.S. Naval Commodore Samuel Barron. Barron was no longer willing to support Eaton's scheme to free the American hostages by putting Hamet back in power in Tripoli.
I can well imagine he was gnashing his teeth, shall we say, frustrated, recognizing that all this had probably been for nothing, that it wasn't going to go any farther.
Eaton kept the news a secret, even from his closest colleagues. If he told Hamet, he feared everything between them would collapse. Then, on the 11th of June, at 6 in the evening, the warship Constellation sailed along the coast of North Africa and into Derna Harbor. On board the ship, Eaton was given a letter from the American diplomat Tobias Lear. On the 3rd of June, Lear had signed a peace treaty with Hamet's brother Yusuf, the ruler of Tripoli. The United States government had agreed to pay $60,000 for the release of the 300 American prisoners. In addition, there would be no annual tribute.
And that's when we simply abandoned Hamet. It wasn't our goal to overthrow Yusuf or to put Hamet on the throne. Hamet was only useful to us inasmuch as we could use him to get our prisoners free.
Thank you.
In another letter, the Commodore of the fleet ordered Eaton to withdraw his men immediately and evacuate Derna. It was the end of William Eaton's great adventure.
I think Eaton, for the rest of his life, was terribly frustrated and felt that he'd been betrayed, perhaps even, by his country.
The next morning, Eaton sent for Hamet and Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon.
Gentlemen.
Sir.
I have most distressing news.
Eaton told them about Lear's treaty and the order to evacuate the city.
We have been robbed of a just and honorable victory.
This cannot be. There must be some
Asma,
Hamet was devastated.
break your promise is not to cooperate with me, but with my enemy.
All Hamet's hopes for regaining the throne evaporated.
He put all his eggs with Eaton. He thought that he will get his throne back, and he was defeated. And he lost everything. So he was conflicted and confused and humiliated.
Hamet warned Eaton that no one else must know about the treaty. The mercenary fighters would seek revenge if they discovered they were being abandoned.
There was a whole mobilized local population against the occupation of Derna. That was seen as a foreign intervention. And Hamet was seen as a collaborator.
At 10 p.m., Eaton and O'Bannon began to order the Christian soldiers and also Hamet and his entourage to the quayside.
And then they began to evacuate first the cannoneers, and Hamet and his retinue, and then the Marines.
Eaton watched sadly as his men climbed into the landing craft and rowed out to the USS Constellation. Eaton was the last to leave.
And as they pulled out into the harbor, then everyone in the city knew what was happening.
In his journal, Eaton describes the agonizing moment he abandoned his mercenary army.
I stepped into a small boat and just had time to save my distance when the shore, our camp, crowded with the distracted soldiery and populace, some calling on the Pasha, some on me, some uttering shrieks and execrations.
Eaton was deeply disappointed and frustrated by Lear's peace treaty. Victory had been snatched from his fingertips. Hamet Karamanli never regained his throne from his brother Yusuf. Years later, he was again exiled to Egypt. Eaton never heard from Hamet again. On the 18th of November 1805, exactly 1 year after his journey began in Egypt, William Eaton returned to Washington.
He was instantly lionized as a great hero. And the idea that he would, dressed in Arab robes, using a scimitar, would lead a march of 540 miles, captured the public's imagination, and made him a great hero.
But Eaton became obsessed by the idea that the national honor had been stained by the agreement to pay for peace. He started drinking heavily in Washington pubs, boasting extravagantly about his exploits and heaping vitriolic criticism on the Jefferson administration.
Jefferson had lost his nerve. All our prisoners would have been free for not even a penny.
He would not accept that it was over. And Eaton went downhill emotionally, psychologically. I think we'd have to say, really, if we really knew the truth, he drank himself to death.
On the 1st of June 1811, 47-year-old William Eaton died in obscurity, never having achieved the honor he so desperately craved.
A hero, a complex man, but not someone who's well remembered. Eaton seems to have been lost somehow in history.
I think Eaton comes across as an early pioneer of colonization. Somebody who wants to pursue American influence and influence, regardless of the local point of view.
After the United States Treaty with Tripoli was signed in 1805, the Barbary corsairs continued periodically to intercept American merchant ships in the southern Mediterranean. It would require another round of U.S. naval assaults against Algiers following the War of 1812 to finally end the system of tribute in the waters off the Barbary coast. William Eaton was a man obsessed with his own vision of conquest. He amassed an army of mercenaries and, with only a handful of United States Marines, led them all across the Egyptian desert to do battle in America's first overseas war. William Eaton's struggle against Tripoli in 1805 did not directly change the course of world events. However, it did serve to introduce the United States as a formidable force in world politics, a new and determined player among the powerful nations of the world.
It is our first significant interaction with the Muslim world. And it is unfortunate that this initial interaction is one of hostility. And so it does set up a view on this side of the Atlantic of the Muslim world which was inaccurate, is biased, but nonetheless feeds into all kinds of preconceptions about what that foreign place is like.
The War of Tripoli, one could see in it a microcosm or a predecessor of what's happening now in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq. Tripoli was an unreasonable state that needed to be coerced into accepting a different behavior. The tensions that drove the United States to clash with Muslims during the age of Barbary wars continue to operate today. It's a clash, if you want, of fundamentalisms. How to break out of this impasse, how to break out of this deadlock is the question that everybody should be trying to answer right now.